Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. In between my longer conversations with people who fascinate and inspire and challenge me, I share a short personal reflection, a focused episode that brings you the ideas, stories, questions, ponderings, and perspectives that animate conversing and give voice to the purpose and heart of the show. Thanks for listening with me. When I was growing up, one of the things that my parents always taught my brother and me to do was to enter the room listening and not talking. I think that it served me really well as a little kid. I had an extended family that were frequently around, a house full of noise and voices and play and laughter and conversations and jokes and storytelling. And the whole point was enter listening. Enter as a person who's trying to pay attention to others rather than a person that's trying to suddenly insert yourself on top of the conversation that's already underway. I really, of course, resisted that at various times as a kid because I loved bursting into a room and announcing something like many little kids do. But I gradually came to realize this is a great gift. And I realized that when I entered the room listening, the speaker of the story, which was often these great family stories, would nod as they were talking and acknowledge me. I felt like I was seen and welcomed. It was a kind of hospitality. While they went on with their story, often with my mouth slightly dropping because the stories were often so entertaining and amazing. And I think what I learned in that was that it gave the speaker permission to keep going on, that I was not arriving to distract them. I was arriving to participate with everyone else in hearing the story. And they kept telling the story. And by my reaction, I kept feeding, wanting more stories by doing, I think, more attentive listening. And it was one of the great parts of my childhood, was listening to these, septuagenarians, octogenarians, nonagenarians tell their stories. I just reveled in it. And I have to say, it's been a gift that I think my parents gave me and which I've tried to keep cultivating through my whole life. So it was really natural to me when thinking about a possible podcast that I wanted it to be called Conversing because I believe in conversation and I believe that we're in a crisis of conversation in our culture. And secondly, because I really love listening and I was eager to be able to hear people say what they wanted to say on their own terms. And I was here not so much as an investigative journalist or anything even remotely like that, so much as an attentive, earnest ear. I wanted to hear who they were. I wanted to pay attention to their nuance, to their style, to their personality. Some guests are people that I've known, many are not. And as a consequence, I've wanted to discover, to explore, to assume that really the focus of the Attention and Conversing podcast episodes is really the guest. And I'm eager for there to be an exchange, but I do tend to be quieter than some podcast hosts would rather be, because in fact, I really do want to learn. When I became a Christian, I was stunned by the fact that Jesus had so much to say and that I had so little clue about what it was that he was describing. And I realized that this advice of my parents, enter the room listening, absolutely pertained to what it meant to be a disciple, that I was called to be a listening disciple, not a speaking disciple. Now, of course, my work and vocation has caused me to do lots of speaking, which has meant my personal monitoring of how much listening I do is all the more important, because I do assume that what Jesus is up to, what he is saying, what he's wanting to say in a given moment is probably going to arise out of what I really need first to hear. So I think that orientation to discipleship has meant what I hope it means on Conversing in general, that we begin as listeners, that we begin as learners, that we begin as genuine, interested, empathetic people who are called to know and see and hear one another. When you enter the room listening, you do have to decide whether you're prepared to be present to what's happening there, or whether what you may have just been doing should somehow take center stage. So there's a way in which I think you have to pause, obviously not necessarily physically, not even all that consciously, but to some degree deliberately, and say what I'm bringing into the room only occasionally should be the thing of first importance. Instead, I think what I realized was that the thing of first importance was what was already happening in the room, and that I was getting to join and find a place in it. What has to be surrendered, though, is any claim that the room should give its attention to me. And that comes down to, am I free in myself to continue to simply be me and to be present, but to not demand center place? I often found myself asking, why is it better to enter the room listening instead of speaking? It was my parents' advice, but why was it advice? And was it good advice? I think one of the things that convinced me it was good advice was that it allowed me to immediately experience the feast of what was already going on in the room. So I'm listening literally to whoever might be speaking, but what I'm also doing visually is that I'm quickly looking around at everyone else that's in the room. I'm trying to read the body language of what they're saying and not saying, of how they're relishing or sometimes not relishing the story that's being told, how they're expressing caution or hope or joy or delight or whatever it might be. And by entering the room listening, I could then take in both the speaker and survey all the other people that might be in the room. And that enhanced my listening by already giving me then a head start in jumping on board with what was happening and how the story, the speaker was sharing whatever it was that they might be saying. It gave me a chance to enter observationally and emotionally in a different way than the emotional anxiety of bringing my agenda or my voice or my assumptions to the room. Instead, I was trying to enter the spirit of what was happening in the room, and especially the person who was speaking. So that is a great advantage because it meant that it was so much more than simply my getting my voice heard. Of course, like any young child, there's moments when you just insistently want your voice to be the one that's heard. And that's fair and legitimate, but it's certainly not sufficient for all the great relishing delights that human conversation and relationship and knowledge of others can bring about. And I was just aware that I was at a feast and that I would want to share in all that the room had to offer. And that usually meant entering into what was already there rather than assuming it was what I was myself bringing. Now, of course, it meant as time went on in that conversation, I was free to enter in or not, depending on who was speaking. I was free to comment or not. I remember adult guests that my parents would have who were not family members and whose relationships with my parents were more of a mystery to me than relatives where I saw them constantly together in various ways. And I think in that context too, I learned a lot about my parents by watching how my parents would listen to their guests and how they would treat their guests, which I could see was similar, but also in some cases really quite different from the way that they would treat their peers within our family. So I felt like it was really an invitation to a richer experience. And I think long haul, that's exactly what listening can do. What I think listening gave me was an opportunity to realize that I could just behold someone, behold them visually, behold them audially, to sit in the wonder, the awe, the mystery, the difference of their life from mine, and just absorb it in a way that was such a delight. It was also humbling. It also reminded me frequently of how much I had yet to learn, how much I really often didn't understand about what was being said, who I didn't have context, or I didn't have further details. Yet absorbing the experience of just coming to apprehend in a deep, internalized, emotional, present way was something that stretched my heart. It stretched my mind. It gave me an anticipation of growing into greater knowledge of people who were like and also very unlike me. And that felt like an invitation to adventure. And if listening does anything, it leads us into adventure. Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.